They arrived as enemies but left as reluctant ambassadors. Between 1942 and 1945, over 372,000 German prisoners of war found themselves transported across the Atlantic to an unexpected captivity in the United States, a nation they had been taught to hate. What awaited them was so shocking that many refused to write home about it, fearing their families would think they were lying or had been coerced. The daily cigarettes, chocolate bars, hearty meals, and fair treatment seemed impossible to reconcile with the Nazi propaganda that had portrayed Americans as degenerate, weak, and cruel. For many German POWs, America's prosperity and democratic values weren't just a surprise. They were a profound ideological crisis. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. In the bitter winter of 1942, as the war raged across Europe and the Pacific, the first German prisoners began arriving on American shores. Most came from the North African Campaign, where Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had suffered devastating defeats at the hands of British and American forces. These men, some still in their desert uniforms, coated with the fine sand of the Tunisian desert, stepped off transport ships onto the docks of cities like New York, Boston, and Norfolk, blinking in confusion. They had been prepared for torture, mistreatment, or execution. Instead, they were greeted with medical examinations, clean clothing, and hot meals. The prisoner, who would later become known as Fritz from Frankfurt, recalled his arrival in a memoir written decades later. "We stood in formation on the dock, exhausted after weeks at sea, still expecting the worst. An American officer approached and spoke through an interpreter. 'You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention,' he said. 'You will receive the same rations as American soldiers, appropriate housing, and fair treatment.' We did not believe him. We could not believe him. It contradicted everything we had been told. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established clear guidelines for the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Unlike some other combatants in the conflict, America had both the resources and the geographical security to fully implement these protocols. 3,000 miles of ocean separated the POW camps from the battlefields of Europe, making escape nearly impossible and allowing for a more relaxed security environment. This distance from the front lines created a unique psychological atmosphere for both the prisoners and their captors. The initial processing of German POWs followed a carefully structured protocol. After disembarking from transport ships, prisoners were sent to one of the temporary holding centers along the East Coast. There, they were registered, fingerprinted, and issued a POW serial number. Military intelligence officers conducted preliminary interviews, separating those with valuable intelligence or specialized skills. Nazi Party members and SS officers were identified and often segregated from the general POW population. Each prisoner received a medical examination, treatment for any wounds or illnesses, a shower, delousing if necessary, and a complete set of new clothing, marked with the letters PW. The War Department had prepared for this massive influx by constructing a network of camps across 46 states. By war's end, there would be over 700 main camps and branch camps scattered across the American landscape, from the forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona. These facilities were typically built according to the same standards as American military training camps, with wooden barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation facilities, and in many cases, theaters and sports fields. The base camps were substantial installations housing between 2,000 and 4,000 prisoners each. Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and Fort McClellan in Alabama were among the largest. From these main camps, prisoners were often assigned to smaller branch camps, which typically held 250 to 750 men. These satellite facilities were established near farms, factories, and forests where prisoner labor was needed. The location of these camps was strategically chosen, with most situated far from coastal areas and major population centers to minimize escape opportunities and public concern. Colonel William Catron, who supervised the establishment of several POW facilities in the Midwest, explained the reasoning. We selected sites with adequate housing infrastructure, access to transportation for moving prisoners, and proximity to areas with labor shortages. But we also needed locations that would minimize contact between prisoners and civilians, at least initially. Americans were losing sons and husbands in Europe. We couldn't appear to be coddling the enemy. The contrast between American POW camps and those of other warring nations was stark. In Germany, American POWs often faced severe food shortages, inadequate medical care, and forced labor in dangerous conditions. In Japan, Allied prisoners endured brutal treatment, starvation, and atrocities that would later be classified as war crimes. By comparison, German POWs in America found themselves in conditions that many would later describe as superior to their own military barracks. Heinrich Müller, a former tank commander captured in North Africa, described his arrival at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The first morning, we were served eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with real sugar and milk. Some of us thought it was a special meal to impress International Red Cross inspectors. When we had the same quality food the next day, and the next, we were astonished. In the Africa Corps, we had subsisted on poor rations for months. The standard meal plan for German POWs was identical to that provided to American garrison troops, though not as rich as that given to combat soldiers. Breakfast typically included eggs, breakfast meat, toast, coffee, and fruit. Lunch and dinner featured meat, vegetables, bread, dessert, and coffee or milk. The daily caloric intake averaged between 3,000 and 3,400 calories, a figure that exceeded what many Americans at home received under civilian rationing programs. This abundance created a peculiar political problem for camp administrators. As U.S. civilians endured food rationing, reports of well-fed German prisoners receiving butter, meat, and sugar caused resentment in some communities. The War Department responded with a public information campaign explaining that adherence to the Geneva Convention was not only legally required but strategically necessary to ensure reciprocal treatment for American POWs in German hands. Congressman Andrew May of Kentucky voiced the frustrations of many Americans in a 1944 speech. My constituents are incensed at seeing German prisoners fed better than our own civilians. They don't understand why the enemy gets chocolate and cigarettes while American families sacrifice. In response, the War Department circulated photographs of American POWs receiving Red Cross packages in German camps with the caption, "This is why we follow the Geneva Convention. Despite these political pressures, the American authorities maintained the prescribed standard of care." Daily life in the camps quickly established a routine that many prisoners found surprisingly comfortable. Reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m., followed by breakfast at 6:15. Work details departed at 7:30, whether to agricultural fields, canneries, or other approved labor sites. Those remaining in camp performed maintenance duties. Lunch was served at noon and the workday ended at 5:30 p.m., followed by dinner at 6 p.m. Prisoners had free time in the evenings until lights out at 10 p.m. The labor program became one of the most successful and controversial aspects of the POW experience. Initially, prisoners worked only on military installations. However, as the American labor shortage grew more acute with millions of men overseas, the War Department expanded the program to include agricultural work, food processing, logging, and other non-military industries. By 1944, German POWs were harvesting crops from Maine to California, cutting pulpwood in the forests of Wisconsin, and picking cotton in the fields of Texas and Arkansas. They worked in canneries, laundries, ice plants, and manufacturing facilities. The program addressed critical labor shortages while providing prisoners with activity, purpose, and pocket money. Prisoners received 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen, where, remarkably, cigarettes, candy, beer, and personal items were readily available. Lieutenant James Williams, who supervised a branch camp in Michigan where prisoners harvested sugar beets, noted, "At first the farmers were hesitant, even hostile. These were the enemy, after all. But when they saw how hard the Germans worked, attitudes changed. By the end of the first season, farmers were requesting POW labor specifically, saying they were more reliable than the civilian workers available. The economic impact of this labor was substantial. By 1945, POW labor contributed an estimated $131 million, equivalent to approximately $1.9 billion in 2025 dollars, to the American economy. Prisoners salvaged approximately 60 million pounds of food from agricultural fields that would otherwise have rotted due to labor shortages. They packed 520 million cans of fruit and vegetables, cut 250 million board feet of lumber, and cleared thousands of acres of farmland. For many prisoners, this work provided their first close interactions with ordinary Americans, encounters that frequently contradicted Nazi characterizations of American society. Horst Wendlandt, who worked on a potato farm in Idaho, recalled, "The farmer's wife would bring us lemonade and cookies in the afternoon. Sometimes she sent out extra sandwiches at lunch. We had been told Americans were our enemies, that they hated Germans. But these people treated us like human beings. Such interactions were technically forbidden by military regulations, which prohibited fraternization between prisoners and civilians. However, as the war progressed and labor programs expanded, these rules proved increasingly difficult to enforce. Agricultural work, in particular, created opportunities for casual contact that gradually humanized the enemy for both prisoners and Americans. In some communities, these interactions evolved into genuine friendships. In Claremont County, Ohio, where German POWs worked in the Campbell's Soup Factory, local residents recalled prisoners being invited to Sunday dinners, taught to play baseball, and even attending church services under guard. Similar stories emerged from rural communities across America, where the proximity of labor and the shared routines of daily life broke down ideological barriers. Not all Americans welcomed this fraternization. Gold Star mothers, women who had lost sons in combat, frequently protested what they perceived as overly lenient treatment. Veterans organizations sometimes objected to German prisoners working in their communities while American soldiers were fighting and dying overseas. The American Legion Post in Hoopeston, Illinois, passed a resolution condemning the mollycoddling of Nazi prisoners after reports emerged of POWs receiving ice cream at the local cannery where they worked. These tensions highlighted a fundamental dilemma in America's POW program. The humanitarian treatment prescribed by the Geneva Convention often conflicted with the emotional realities of a nation at war. Military authorities walked a difficult line between international legal obligations and domestic political pressures. The War Department's consistent position was that proper treatment of German POWs served American interest by protecting U.S. soldiers in enemy hands, a pragmatic rationale that eventually gained acceptance in most communities. Within the camps themselves, a complex society developed. The American authorities generally followed the German military's chain of command, allowing prisoners to maintain their rank structure and handle minor disciplinary issues internally. This approach streamlined administration and reinforced order, but also preserved Nazi influence in many camps, particularly in the early years of the program. Werner Drexler, a prisoner at Camp McCain in Mississippi, described the internal dynamics in our compound. The senior NCO was a dedicated Nazi. He organized political education sessions in the evenings and kept a list of men who expressed anti-Hitler sentiments. Those who were too openly critical received smaller food portions or were assigned to less desirable work details. Some were beaten at night. The Americans did not see what happened after they locked the gates. This hidden Nazi influence was a significant challenge for American administrators. In some camps, hardcore Nazis established shadow governments, enforcing Nazi discipline and terrorizing prisoners with democratic or anti-fascist leanings. They organized secret courts known as kangaroo courts to try and punish traitors. In at least 7 documented cases, these unofficial tribunals resulted in the murder of prisoners deemed disloyal to the Reich. The most notorious case occurred at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, where Werner Drexler was transferred after agreeing to cooperate with American intelligence. On March 12, 1944, after being in the camp less than 24 hours, he was beaten and hanged by fellow prisoners who had discovered his cooperation with the Americans. Following military trials, 7 German POWs were executed for his murder, the only German POWs executed on American soil during the war. In response to these internal threats, American authorities implemented a segregation program in late 1944, classifying prisoners as black, ardent Nazis, white anti-Nazis, or gray as politically neutral. Anti-Nazi prisoners were transferred to separate camps, most notably Fort Eustis in Virginia and Camp Campbell in Kentucky, where they could live without fear of reprisal. Committed Nazis were concentrated in more secure facilities, including Camp Alva in Oklahoma and Camp Lordsburg in New Mexico. This segregation program improved safety and camp administration, but it also created opportunities for more targeted re-education efforts. The American authorities had initially approached the POW program primarily as a detention operation with no official attempts to influence prisoners' political beliefs. By 1944, however, as the scale of Nazi atrocities became clearer and planning for post-war Germany began, attitudes shifted. The Special War Problems Division of the State Department, working with the Provost Marshal General's Office, developed the Intellectual Diversion Program, later renamed the Re-Education Program. This initiative aimed to expose German prisoners to accurate information about American society and democratic principles, countering years of Nazi propaganda without violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition on political indoctrination. Captain Walter Schoenstedt, a German-born American officer who helped design the program, explained its subtle approach. We could not force political conversion that would violate international law and alienate the prisoners. Instead, we created voluntary opportunities for prisoners to learn about American institutions and history. We made democracy available, not compulsory. The program operated through camp libraries, film screenings, voluntary classes, and a POW newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. Camp libraries were stocked with carefully selected books, works by banned German authors like Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque, classics of American literature, and factual accounts of Nazi atrocities. Film screenings included documentaries about American life, historical dramas emphasizing democratic themes, and eventually, footage from liberated concentration camps. Der Ruf became the program's most effective tool. Edited by anti-fascist German writers who were themselves prisoners, the newspaper provided war news, cultural articles, and political commentary with a subtle democratic orientation. At its peak, Der Ruf reached a circulation of 95,000 copies per issue. While the publication maintained a neutral tone on the war itself, it consistently presented democratic governance as the natural future for post-war Germany. Educational opportunities expanded dramatically under this program. By 1945, over 30,000 German POWs were enrolled in correspondence courses through American universities. Subjects ranged from English language and American history to engineering, agriculture, and business administration. Camp Concordia in Kansas established a connection with nearby Kansas State University, allowing prisoners to earn transferable college credits. Similar arrangements emerged at camps across the country. For many prisoners, these educational opportunities represented their first exposure to unrestricted intellectual inquiry after years under Nazi censorship. Otto Engelhardt, who took courses in agricultural science while interned at Fort Riley, Kansas, later wrote, "In Germany, education had become indoctrination. At Fort Riley, I discovered what it meant to study without political constraints. We could question, debate, explore ideas freely. This was my first taste of intellectual freedom, and it was intoxicating." The recreational aspects of camp life also contributed to this atmosphere of relative freedom. Sports became a central feature of POW life, with soccer fields, volleyball courts, and even swimming pools available in many facilities. Prisoners organized leagues, tournaments, and exhibition matches. At Camp Hearn in Texas, the soccer team became so renowned that local high schools requested exhibition matches, though security concerns prevented such direct competition. Theater productions, orchestras, and choirs flourished in the camps. Prisoners with artistic talents found materials and encouragement for their work. Camp Aliceville in Alabama boasted an orchestra with 42 instruments and a choir of 80 voices. Camp Concordia had a theater group that performed German classics and original works. Several camps published literary magazines featuring poetry, short stories, and essays written by prisoners. These creative outlets served multiple purposes. They provided mental stimulation and emotional release for the prisoners. They created a sense of community and purpose within the camps, and they offered subtle opportunities for exposure to democratic and humanistic values through material selection and discussion. The American authorities recognized that boredom represented the greatest threat to camp security and morale. Idleness bred discontent, political extremism, and escape plotting. A comprehensive recreation program addressed these risks while simultaneously advancing re-education goals. As one camp commander observed, a prisoner playing soccer isn't planning an escape or attending a Nazi rally. The contrast between this relative comfort and the desperate situation in Germany grew more pronounced as the war progressed. By late 1944, German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Food shortages in the Reich had become severe. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were dying by the thousands. Yet, in America, German POWs continued to receive adequate food, medical care, and even luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate. This discrepancy created a complex psychological burden for many prisoners. Letters from home described increasing hardship, bombardment, food shortages, and casualties. Some prisoners developed guilt about their relative comfort and safety. Others modified their accounts of camp conditions in letters home, fearing their families would not believe the truth or would resent their good fortune. Karl-Heinz Baumgartner, a prisoner at Camp Crossville in Tennessee, explained this dilemma. "My mother wrote that they had no heat, little food, and American planes overhead every night. Meanwhile, I was playing soccer, watching movies, and eating ice cream. I began lying in my letters, saying we worked 14 hours daily and received only bread and water. I couldn't bear for her to know the truth while she suffered." This psychological distance expanded as news of German defeats on multiple fronts reached the camps. The fall of Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the first major blow to prisoner morale. The D-Day landings in June 1944 created another crisis of confidence. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies approached Berlin, many prisoners faced the collapse not only of their nation, but of their entire worldview. Major William Schrader, who served as executive officer at Camp McCain, Mississippi, observed this transformation. When the 1st Africa Corps men arrived, they were arrogant, convinced of German invincibility. They marched in formation, sang Nazi songs, and predicted they'd soon return to a victorious Germany. By early 1945, the atmosphere had completely changed. The swagger was gone. They stopped talking about German victory and started asking about emigration to America after the war. This ideological crisis became particularly acute following the Ypres liberation of Nazi concentration camps in the spring of 1945. American authorities made the controversial decision to show footage of these atrocities to German prisoners. The screenings were mandatory, justified not as political re-education, but as factual information about wartime events. The impact was profound. Some prisoners refused to believe what they saw, dismissing the footage as propaganda. Others accepted the truth but claimed no prior knowledge of the Holocaust. A significant minority experienced complete psychological collapse as they confronted the crimes committed in the name of ideals they had fought for. A smaller group openly acknowledged their complicity through silence or participation. Captain Robert Jackson, who supervised these screenings at Camp Breckenridge in Kentucky, described the reaction. "We showed the films without commentary, letting the images speak for themselves. The prisoners watched in absolute silence. Afterward, some wept openly. Others seemed catatonic. One man stood up and said in perfect English, 'Now I understand why we had to lose this war.' Another shouted that it was all American lies before being hustled out by his fellow prisoners." The camps were very quiet for days afterward. As Germany approached total defeat, the future of the POW program became uncertain. The Geneva Convention specified that prisoners should be repatriated as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. But the unprecedented nature of Nazi Germany's surrender complicated this process. With Germany occupied and divided among the Allied powers, to whom would the prisoners be returned? How would repatriation work in a nation whose infrastructure had been decimated? These practical questions intertwined with deeper political concerns. American authorities worried about returning thousands of POWs who had witnessed American prosperity to a Germany facing reconstruction under democratic principles. Would these former prisoners become advocates for democracy or bitter opponents? Had the re-education program been sufficient to counter years of Nazi indoctrination? As these questions loomed, German prisoners in America found themselves in an increasingly surreal situation. The war that had brought them to American shores had ended, yet they remained in captivity, continuing their daily routines of work, study, and recreation, while their homeland lay in ruins. This transitional period, between the end of fighting and eventual repatriation, would become one of the most transformative phases of the entire POW experience. The summer of 1945 marked a pivotal transition in the American POW program. With Germany's unconditional surrender on May 5th, prisoners were no longer enemies in an active conflict but displaced persons awaiting return to a defeated homeland. Their legal status remained unchanged. They were still prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, but the psychological reality had transformed completely. The war they had been fighting was over, lost decisively, and their nation no longer existed as they had known it. This new reality manifested in visible changes throughout the camp system. Nazi insignia, which had been permitted in the barracks areas, were now banned entirely. Portraits of Hitler disappeared from walls. The German national anthem was no longer sung at formations. Instead, prisoners began openly discussing democratic governance, federalism, and concepts that would soon form the foundation of West Germany's post-war constitution. For the American authorities, this period presented a crucial opportunity to solidify the re-education program's impact. With Nazi Germany defeated, the prohibition against political indoctrination became less relevant. The focus shifted from neutral presentation of democratic principles to active preparation for participation in post-war German reconstruction. This shift was formalized in a new initiative, the Special Projects Division, SPD, of the Provost Marshal General's Office. The SPD expanded educational opportunities dramatically, establishing formal administrative schools at Fort Getty, Rhode Island, and Fort Wetherill, Rhode Island. These specialized facilities offered intensive training in democratic governance, public administration, and civil engineering, skills that would be desperately needed in devastated German cities. Selected prisoners with anti-Nazi credentials and leadership potential received 6-week courses covering everything from municipal water management to constitutional law. Karl Werner, who attended the Fort Getty School in August 1945, later became a city administrator in Heidelberg. In his memoir, he credited this training with his entire post-war career. What I learned at Fort Getty was precisely what Germany needed, not abstract theories, but practical knowledge of how to rebuild a society on democratic foundations. When I returned to Heidelberg, I found a city in ruins with no functioning government. The Americans appointed me to the Municipal Reconstruction Committee because of my Fort Getty certificate. Within 3 years, I was deputy mayor. Beyond these specialized schools, the SPD created a comprehensive curriculum for use in all POW camps. The German POW School Center at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, developed standardized courses in American history, comparative government, and international relations. By September 1945, more than 22,000 prisoners were enrolled in these formal civics courses, with another 100,000 participating in discussion groups and informal education programs. These educational initiatives gained unexpected support from many prisoners, who now saw democratic skills as essential for personal survival and national reconstruction. With the collapse of the Third Reich, even former Nazi supporters recognized that adaptation was necessary. Enrollment in English language courses surged, as did interest in American business practices, agriculture, and technology. Prisoners who had once dismissed such education as enemy propaganda now approached it as practical preparation for a new reality. This shift was reflected in the evolution of Der Ruf, the POW newspaper. Its circulation expanded to 175,000 copies per issue, and its content became more explicitly democratic. Articles openly discussed German war guilt, the failure of Nazism, and the necessity of adopting democratic institutions. The publication assembled an impressive roster of contributors, including Alfred Anders and Hans Werner Richter, both of whom would become significant literary figures in post-war Germany. The American authorities also expanded the use of film as an educational tool. Documentaries about the American political system, previously shown on a voluntary basis, became part of the standard camp program. Feature films emphasizing themes of individual liberty, civic responsibility, and democratic values circulated widely. Most significantly, newsreels showing the liberation of concentration camps in the Nuremberg trials brought the reality of Nazi crimes directly to the prisoner audience. Major Frank Sterling, who supervised the education program at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, noted the changing reception. In 1944, when we showed films about American democracy, the prisoners were skeptical, even hostile. By late 1945, they were asking questions about how to implement similar systems in Germany. They wanted copies of the U.S. Constitution, books on federalism, practical information. The transformation was remarkable. The labor program also shifted during this transitional period. With the war ended, security concerns diminished, allowing prisoners to work in a wider range of settings. The contract labor system expanded, with German POWs increasingly employed in factories, workshops, and construction projects previously off-limits due to security classifications. This expanded employment created new opportunities for interaction with American civilians and exposure to American industrial methods. Many prisoners developed technical skills that would prove valuable upon repatriation. Those working in agriculture learned about American farming methods, machinery, and crop management. Prisoners employed in food processing plants gained experience with industrial production techniques. Those assigned to construction projects acquired skills in modern building methods and materials. This practical knowledge would later contribute significantly to Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s. Helmut Miller, who worked in a John Deere factory in Moline, Illinois, later established an agricultural equipment dealership in Bavaria. "Everything I knew about modern farming equipment I learned in that factory," he recalled it in a 1965 interview. "When I returned to Germany, farmers were still using pre-war methods and equipment. I understood the future of agriculture because I had seen it in America. My business succeeded because I brought that knowledge home." Even as these educational and labor programs expanded, the question of repatriation loomed larger. The logistical challenges were enormous. Europe's transportation infrastructure had been devastated. The Allies were struggling to feed the German civilian population, raising concerns about returning hundreds of thousands of additional people to an already strained system. Political complications emerged as Germany was divided into occupation zones, each with different policies and priorities. In September 1945, the United States government announced a phased repatriation plan. Prisoners would be returned in groups, beginning with those who had been captured earliest. Anti-Nazi prisoners with valuable skills would receive priority, while confirmed Nazi Party members and SS personnel would be repatriated last. All repatriations would be coordinated with occupation authorities to ensure proper absorption into the devastated German economy. This announcement triggered complex reactions among the prisoner population. Many were eager to return home, desperate to learn the fate of families they had not seen for years. Others expressed apprehension about conditions in defeated Germany and uncertainty about their reception as returning soldiers of a disgraced army. A significant minority, estimated at approximately 14,000, inquired about the possibility of remaining in the United States permanently. The story of Franz Burkhardt illustrates these conflicting emotions. Captured in Tunisia in 1943, Burkhardt had spent 2 years working on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. In that time, he had learned English, developed close relationships with the farm family, and fallen in love with their daughter. When they announced repatriation, I felt torn in half, he later wrote. My family in Dresden had survived the bombing, and I needed to see them. But I had built a new life in Wisconsin. The farmer offered to sponsor me if I could find a way to stay. In the end, I had no choice. The Geneva Convention required my return. I left with a promise to come back someday. Burkhardt's experience was not unique. Across the country, American employers who had come to value German prisoners as reliable workers offered sponsorship, employment contracts, and even family connections. These offers created painful dilemmas for prisoners caught between duty to their families in Germany and unexpected opportunities in America. The Geneva Convention provided no flexibility. All prisoners who were physically able were required to repatriate. The physical process of repatriation began in March 1946. Prisoners were transferred from their assigned camps to embarkation centers along the East Coast. Camp Shanks in New York and Camp Kilmer in New Jersey became the primary processing facilities, with thousands of prisoners passing through daily. Each man received a medical examination, a set of civilian clothes, and a small payment for accumulated work credits. Most were allowed to take personal items acquired during captivity, including books, educational materials, and mementos. The voyage across the Atlantic offered time for reflection. Johannes Liebert, returning to Germany after 3 years in Texas, described the journey in his diary. On the ship, we stand at the railings for hours, watching America disappear behind us. Men talk quietly about what lies ahead. Some boast of rebuilding Germany better than before. Others worry about finding their families, their homes. We have become different men in America, better fed, better educated, perhaps wiser. But we return to a Germany that has also changed in ways we cannot fully imagine. The first glimpse of post-war Germany came as a profound shock to many returning prisoners. Cities lay in ruins, with up to 80% of urban areas destroyed in major population centers. Food shortages were severe, with the average civilian ration providing fewer than 1,200 calories daily, less than half what prisoners had received in American camps. The German economy had collapsed, with the Reichsmark essentially worthless and a thriving black market the only functional economic system. Most devastating were the personal losses. Returning prisoners discovered family members killed in bombing raids or the final Soviet offensive. Homes had been destroyed or occupied by refugees from the East. Wives and girlfriends had formed new relationships, believing their soldiers would never return. Children born during the war did not recognize their fathers. The psychological impact of these discoveries was often more difficult than the physical hardships. Erich Lehmann, repatriated to Hamburg in April 1946, described his homecoming. I found my wife living in one room of our former apartment. The rest had been requisitioned for refugee families from Silesia. She had survived by trading family heirlooms for food. When she saw me, healthy, well-fed, in new clothes, she began to cry. "You look like an American," she said. "We have been starving here." I felt ashamed of my good health, my clean clothes. The chocolate bars and cigarettes I brought as gifts suddenly seemed like obscene luxury. This reverse culture shock was common among returning prisoners. Many felt guilty about their relatively comfortable captivity, while their countrymen had suffered. Others found themselves alienated from a defeated society, struggling with collective shame and material deprivation. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity created psychological barriers that some never fully overcame. Yet, for many returnees, their American experience provided crucial tools for navigating post-war challenges. Those who had participated in the re-education program and administrative schools brought valuable skills and democratic values. Their familiarity with American systems gave them advantages in dealing with occupation authorities. Their technical knowledge gained through the labor program helped them secure employment in the emerging Reconstruction economy. The American authorities had anticipated this potential influence. The final phase of the SPD program included specific preparation for the challenges returnees would face. Prisoners received information about occupation policies, denazification procedures, and Reconstruction priorities. They were encouraged to participate in democratic institution building and to share their knowledge of American practices with their communities. This deliberate preparation yielded significant results. A 1948 survey conducted by occupation authorities found that approximately 63% of returning POWs who had participated in SPD programs were actively involved in democratic political activities, compared to 17% of those who had been held in British or French captivity. Former prisoners from American camps were disproportionately represented in the early civil service of West Germany, particularly in areas related to municipal administration, education, and public works. The influence extended to economic reconstruction as well. Former prisoners who had worked in American agriculture introduced modern farming techniques to their communities. Those with experience in American factories brought knowledge of efficient production methods. The German economic miracle of the 1950s, while primarily attributed to the Marshall Plan and currency reform, was facilitated by thousands of returning POWs who had directly observed American industrial practices. Walter Schoenstedt, who had helped design the re-education program, later observed, "We created an unplanned Marshall Plan of the mind." These men returned to Germany not just with new skills, but with a lived experience of democracy and free enterprise. They became natural ambassadors for the political and economic systems they had witnessed in America. No amount of propaganda could have achieved what their personal testimony accomplished. This influence operated at the community level through countless small interactions. Returning prisoners shared their experiences with families, friends, and colleagues. They described American homes, farms, factories, and institutions. They countered lingering Nazi propaganda about American society. Most importantly, they offered first-hand evidence that democracy and prosperity could coexist, a powerful message in a nation disillusioned by totalitarianism's catastrophic failure. Kurt Meyer, who worked on farms in Nebraska before returning to his village near Hanover, recalled, "In community meetings, when we discussed how to reorganize local government, I could say, 'In America, they do it this way.' People listened because I had seen it work. When farmers debated new methods, my experience in Nebraska gave my voice weight. We were like seeds of American ideas planted throughout Germany." The American authorities recognized this potential influence early in the repatriation process. In 1945, intelligence officers began interviewing selected prisoners about their views on democracy, their post-war plans, and their attitudes toward American occupation. Those who expressed democratic values and showed leadership potential were identified as potential assets for occupation authorities. Their names and information were forwarded to civil affairs officers in the American zone of occupation. This informal network of former prisoners became an important resource for occupation officials struggling to identify reliable local leaders untainted by Nazi associations. In many communities, returning POWs from American camps became natural intermediaries between occupation authorities and the German population. Their familiarity with American practices and their demonstrated reliability during captivity made them valuable partners in implementing denazification and democratization programs. Colonel John Taylor, who served with the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMGUS, later acknowledged this contribution. The former POWs were often our best local allies. They understood both German needs and American intentions. They could translate our policies into terms their communities understood. Many served as unofficial advisors to our civil affairs teams, identifying cooperative local leaders and warning us away from unreconstructed Nazis who had evaded our screening processes. This influence was particularly pronounced in the crucial first 2 years of occupation, when basic democratic institutions were being established under Allied supervision. Former prisoners who had attended the administrative schools at Fort Getty and Fort Wetherill were actively recruited for positions in municipal governments throughout the American zone. Their understanding of democratic principles and administrative procedures made them valuable assets during the transition from military government to German civilian authority. The Baden-Württemberg region provides a striking example of this influence. By 1948, former POWs from American camps held approximately 28% of administrative positions in the region's municipal governments. A similar pattern emerged in Bavaria, Hesse, and Bremen. These returnees brought not just technical knowledge, but cultural understanding. They could work effectively with American occupation authorities while maintaining credibility with the German population. Yet this very effectiveness sometimes created complications. Some Germans viewed these former prisoners with suspicion, labeling them American agents, or questioning their national loyalty. The lingering influence of Nazi ideology, which had portrayed collaboration with the West as treason, complicated their position. In some communities, returning POWs found themselves caught between American occupation authorities who viewed them as allies and neighbors who viewed them as collaborators. Dieter Hoffmann, who served as an assistant mayor in a small Bavarian town after returning from Camp Van Etten in New York, described this tension. Some people whispered that I had been Americanized. They meant it as an accusation. Others came to me privately, asking for help with occupation authorities. I was neither fully German nor American in their eyes, but something in between. It was a difficult position, but it allowed me to help my community navigate those challenging years. This ambiguous status reflected a broader pattern in post-war German society. The nation was undergoing a complex renegotiation of identity, caught between the catastrophic failure of Nazism and the uncertain promise of Western democracy. Returning POWs from American camps embodied this transition. Men who had fought for Hitler's Reich but returned with democratic ideas and American connections. Their experiences mirrored Germany's own journey from totalitarianism toward a new place in the Western democratic order. The final phase of repatriation occurred throughout 1946, with the last German POWs leaving the United States in July of that year. As the program concluded, American authorities conducted exit interviews with thousands of departing prisoners, collecting data that would later prove valuable in assessing the program's impact. These interviews revealed a striking pattern. Approximately 74% of prisoners expressed positive views of the United States, with 24% neutral and only 2% maintaining negative attitudes. These statistics represented a remarkable shift from the hostile attitudes many prisoners had held upon arrival. The change was not merely a matter of political expediency or pragmatic adaptation to defeat. The daily experience of fair treatment, adequate food, educational opportunities, and exposure to American society had genuinely transformed perspectives. Many prisoners who had arrived as committed Nazis departed with fundamental doubts about the ideology they had once embraced. Otto Engelhard, who spent 2 years at Camp Breckinridge, Kentucky, summarized this transformation. "I came to America believing everything Hitler had told us, that Americans were degenerate, undisciplined, racially impure. I found instead a strong, productive society with opportunities I had never imagined. Yes, I saw problems and contradictions, but I also saw a system that could acknowledge and address its own flaws. This was the greatest revelation, a society that could criticize itself and still function, even thrive." This shift in perspective had profound implications for Germany's post-war development. Returning POWs constituted approximately 1.8% of West Germany's adult male population in 1946, a small but influential minority. Their distribution across all sectors of society, from rural villages to urban centers, from agriculture to industry to government, amplified their impact. In countless workplaces, community organizations, and local governments, these veterans shared their American experiences, subtly influencing Germany's emerging democratic culture. The formal POW program had ended, but its effects continued to ripple through German society. In 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, established its democratic constitution, former prisoners from American camps participated in the process at various levels, from municipal discussions to state constitutional conventions. The new German Basic Law, with its federalist structure and strong protections for individual rights, reflected principles many returnees had studied in American POW camps. By the early 1950s, as West Germany achieved sovereignty and began its remarkable economic recovery, the distinctive contribution of these veterans became less visible, but no less significant. They had been integrated into the fabric of society, their American experiences becoming part of the collective memory that shaped Germany's new democratic identity. Their individual stories of captivity, education, labor, and return merged into the larger narrative of post-war reconstruction. Yet these experiences were not forgotten. In 1952, the first formal association of former German POWs from American camps was established in Munich. Similar organizations soon emerged across West Germany, creating networks that preserved and shared these memories. Annual reunions, publications, and correspondence with former American employers and guards maintained connections across the Atlantic. These associations often emphasized their members' role as informal ambassadors between the former enemies, now Cold War allies. Hans Gerlach, who helped establish the Bavarian Association of Former POWs, explained the organization's purpose. "We gathered not to reminisce about the war. We had no desire to glorify that terrible time. Rather, we met to honor the unexpected humanity we had experienced in America, and to strengthen the growing friendship between our nations." We had seen American democracy firsthand. Now, as Germany built its own democratic system, we wanted to contribute that perspective. As the Cold War intensified, these veterans found themselves in a unique position. Their personal knowledge of America made them natural advocates for the Western Alliance and skeptics of Soviet communism. Many became active in West German politics, particularly in the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, and Free Democratic Party, FDP, parties that emphasized Atlantic partnership and democratic values. Their influence helped consolidate West Germany's orientation toward the United States and integration into NATO. American diplomatic and military officials recognized this influence. A 1955 State Department memorandum noted, "Former German POWs held in the United States constitute an underutilized asset in our public diplomacy efforts." Their first-hand experience of American society provides credible counterweight to Soviet propaganda. Efforts should be made to engage these individuals in cultural exchange programs and information initiatives targeting German public opinion. This recommendation led to specific outreach efforts. The United States Information Agency, USIA, established a program to reconnect with former prisoners, particularly those who had participated in the Special Projects Division educational programs. Former POWs were invited to attend cultural events at American centers in major German cities, participate in exchange programs, and contribute to publications about German-American relations. Their testimonials about American life featured prominently in USIA materials distributed throughout West Germany. These formal programs built upon thousands of informal connections that had developed during captivity. Many German prisoners had maintained correspondence with American families, employers, and guards after repatriation. Some had renewed these relationships as Germany's economic situation improved and international travel became possible. By the late 1950s, former POWs began returning to the United States as tourists, visiting the camps where they had been held and the communities where they had worked. Friedrich Becker, who had worked on a Minnesota farm while a prisoner, at Camp Algona, Iowa, made his first return visit in 1957. I drove up to the farmhouse, not sure if anyone would remember me after 12 years, he recalled. The farmer's wife opened the door, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Fritz, you're late for dinner." Then she hugged me and called for her husband. I spent 2 weeks with them, helping with the harvest just as I had as a prisoner. But this time, I was there as a friend and guest. Similar reunions occurred across the United States, from the apple orchards of Washington State to the potato fields of Maine. These personal connections, multiplied thousands of times, created an informal network of relationships that helped heal the wounds of war and strengthen the emerging German-American partnership. What had begun as a pragmatic program for detaining enemy soldiers had evolved into an unintended but powerful instrument of reconciliation. The long-term impact of this reconciliation became evident during the Berlin crisis of 1961. As the Soviet Union threatened Western access to Berlin and constructed the Berlin Wall, West German public opinion strongly supported the American position despite the risks of confrontation. Polling data showed particularly strong pro-American sentiment among those who had personal connections to the United States, including former POWs and their families. These individuals often served as opinion leaders in their communities, countering Soviet propaganda with first-hand accounts of American society. By the 1960s, as the World War II generation began to age, efforts to document the POW experience intensified. Academic historians in both Germany and the United States conducted interviews, collected documents, and published the first scholarly analyses of the program. These studies highlighted the complex interaction between detention, labor, education, and reconciliation that characterized the American approach to German prisoners. Arthur Smith, whose 1968 dissertation provided the first comprehensive analysis of the re-education program, concluded the American POW program represents one of the most successful instances of democratic influence in modern history. Without violating the Geneva Convention or employing coercive indoctrination, the program exposed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to democratic principles through daily experience. Many became lifelong advocates for these principles upon their return to Germany, contributing significantly to that nation's successful democratization. This scholarly recognition coincided with more public commemorations. In 1968, the first formal reunion of German ex-POWs and their former American guards took place at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Similar events followed at other former campsites. Local historical societies began preserving the physical remnants of the camps, most of which had been dismantled after the war, and collecting artifacts, photographs, and testimonials. Museums and exhibits exploring the POW experience opened in communities that had hosted camps. These commemorations often emphasized the humanitarian aspects of the program and its contribution to post-war reconciliation. They highlighted stories of kindness, respect, and unexpected friendship that had developed across enemy lines. While not ignoring the reality of captivity or the genuine conflicts that had existed within the camps, these narratives focused on the program's role in healing the wounds of war and building a foundation for peace. For the aging veterans themselves, these commemorations provided opportunities to process complex memories and emotions. Many had never fully shared their POW experiences with families and friends. The public recognition of this chapter in their lives allowed them to integrate these memories into their personal narratives and receive acknowledgement for their unintended role as bridges between former enemies. Walter Kremser, who attended a 1975 reunion at the site of Camp Shelby, Mississippi, expressed this sentiment. "For 30 years, I kept my time in America mostly to myself. In Germany after the war, it seemed better not to talk about having had enough food and decent treatment while others starved. Now, standing here with American friends and fellow prisoners, I can finally acknowledge how this experience changed my life, how it showed me another way of living and thinking that I carried back to Germany." As the Cold War entered its final decade, the legacy of the POW program acquired new significance. The ongoing division of Germany and the confrontation between NATO and the Warsaw Pact made German-American relations critically important for European security. The personal connections established through the POW program, maintained through correspondence, visits, and organizational ties, provided a human foundation for this strategic partnership. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, triggering the process that would lead to German reunification, these connections took on historical poignancy. Many former POWs, now in their 70s and 80s, saw the peaceful end of the Cold War as validation of the democratic values they had encountered in American captivity. The democratic transformation of Eastern Europe and the peaceful reunification of Germany represented the fulfillment of hopes many had carried since their repatriation more than 4 decades earlier. The POW program's historical significance continued to evolve in the post-Cold War era. As historians gained access to previously classified American records and newly available German archives, more comprehensive studies emerged. These works placed the program in broader context, connecting it to American occupation policies, the Marshall Plan, and the development of the Western Alliance. The program came to be recognized as an important, if unplanned, component of the successful democratization of West Germany. For the dwindling number of surviving veterans, the new millennium brought final opportunities to share their experiences with younger generations. Oral history projects, documentary films, and educational programs captured their testimonies before they were lost. These first-hand accounts revealed the profound impact of small, human interactions: the guard who shared a chocolate bar, the farmer's wife who mended a torn shirt, the librarian who recommended a book, that collectively shaped their perception of America and its values. Historians continue to debate the extent to which the POW program influenced Germany's post-war development. Some emphasize its limited reach, affecting only a small percentage of the population, while others highlight the strategic distribution of returnees throughout German society and their disproportionate representation in local leadership positions. The precise measurement of such influence remains elusive, embedded as it is in countless personal decisions and community interactions spanning decades. What remains clear is the program's role as an unexpected instrument of reconciliation. What began as a pragmatic solution to the problem of enemy detention evolved into a complex human exchange with lasting consequences for both nations. In the prisoners who received cigarettes and chocolate, small kindnesses that contradicted years of propaganda, America inadvertently created ambassadors for democratic values and witnesses to the possibility of a different relationship between former enemies. The enduring legacy of this program lies not in statistics or policy documents, but in transformed lives and relationships. It is visible in the German businessman who maintains correspondence with the American family whose farm he worked on as a prisoner. It lives in the municipal administrator whose democratic leadership was shaped by courses taken at Fort Getty. It continues in the family histories, passed through generations, of unexpected kindness received when it was least expected, when two nations were officially at war. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in German-American relations, we recognize that its success emerged not primarily from formal policies, but from basic human decency maintained even toward enemies. The daily implementation of Geneva Convention standards, adequate food, medical care, educational opportunities, and protection from abuse created an environment where enemies could begin to see each other as human beings. This foundation of mutual recognition made possible the later political alignment, economic partnership, and cultural exchange that have characterized German-American relations for over 7 decades. The story of German POWs in America reminds us that peace is built not just through treaties and institutions, but through human connections forged across dividing lines. The cigarettes, chocolate, and fair treatment that so surprised these prisoners represented something more profound than material comfort. They demonstrated the possibility of maintaining humanity even in conflict, a lesson that resonates beyond this specific historical moment to all efforts at reconciliation and peace building.